I thought Eleanor had come to congratulate us on the new house. I thought the bottle of wine in her hands and the careful smile on her face meant she was finally trying. I had no idea she had driven 3 hours not to celebrate, but to warn me that the man I had married for 6 years had been hiding something beneath the floorboards of the very house we were standing in, something that belonged to me long before I ever met him. She set the wine down on the kitchen counter without opening it, turned to me with those pale, still eyes of hers and said, "Your mother left you more than you know, and Daniel knows exactly where it is." I felt the room tilt, not because of what she said, but because Eleanor had never, not once in 6 years, taken my side over her son's, and yet there she stood, steady as a judge, telling me my husband was a liar. The house smelled like fresh paint and sawdust and the faint sweetness of the cleaning solution I had used on the windows that morning. We had moved in 11 days ago. 11 days of carrying boxes, debating where to put the couch, laughing when we discovered the bathroom door swung the wrong way and hit the towel rack. 11 days of thinking, finally, this is ours. I had painted the kitchen myself, a warm cream color that my mother would have called the color of good bread. I had chosen it because of her, because this was supposed to be a new beginning, built on something she had given me, on the small inheritance that had made the down payment possible, on the sense that even from wherever she was still helping me build a life. My name is Anna. I am 34 years old. I was, a woman who believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, in not making mountains out of molehills, in choosing peace over conflict, because there had already been enough conflict in my life growing up. My mother, Vera, died when I was 29. She had been a quiet, careful woman who spent 40 years working as a seamstress and saving every coin she could squeeze out of a modest life. She never owned much that was flashy. She never wore gold or diamonds or made a show of anything. But she had one thing that mattered: a set of pieces her own mother had brought from the old country when she emigrated. Small things: a brooch, 2 rings, a pendant, a pair of earrings, not worth a fortune by a jeweler's estimate, but irreplaceable in every way that actually counted. My grandmother had worn those pieces at her wedding, and her mother before her, and when Vera gave them to me 2 months before she died, sitting in the hospital bed in that terrible papery gown, her hands still elegant even when her body was failing, she pressed them into my palm and said, "These go with you, not with anyone else, with you." I had nodded. I had cried. I had put them in the small velvet box she handed me and promised. Daniel was there that day. He had driven me to the hospital, waited in the corridor, brought terrible vending machine coffee, and held my hand in the car on the way home. He had been kind. He had been, I thought, exactly the kind of man you wanted beside you when the world was falling apart. We had been married 2 years at that point, and I had never doubted him. Not once, not seriously. He was steady and practical, and sometimes too quiet, but I had put that down to personality, not concealment. We were not the kind of couple who shared every thought. We had our silences, our separate spaces. I had always thought that was healthy. I was beginning to understand it might have been something else entirely. After my mother's funeral, I had placed the velvet box in the bottom of my jewelry drawer, wrapped in a silk scarf Vera had also given me. I checked on it occasionally, on anniversaries, on her birthday, on the day I needed to feel her close. The last time I remembered opening that drawer with any real attention was 6 months ago, before we started packing for the move. I had seen the scarf. I had not, I now realized, actually opened the velvet box. I had assumed. I had trusted. I had moved 100 boxes into this cream-colored house and unpacked everything and arranged my life and never once thought to verify. Daniel and I had met at a mutual friend's dinner party when I was 27, married at 28, and spent the first years of our marriage in a rented apartment that was always too small and too cold in winter. The house was supposed to be the reward for all that patience. The cramped kitchen, the upstairs neighbor who walked like a parade, the single wardrobe we shared and fought over. The house was mine and Daniel's future, bought with my mother's savings and our combined mortgage, a 3-bedroom with a garden on a quiet street where I could eventually, hopefully, plant tomatoes. It was not grand, but it was ours, or so I believed. Eleanor, Daniel's mother, had never been warm to me, but she had not been cruel either, at least not openly. She was a woman who communicated primarily through implication, a slightly raised eyebrow when I served store-bought pastries, a pause just a fraction too long before complimenting my cooking, a habit of addressing Daniel first in any conversation, even when I had asked the question. She had made it quietly clear from the beginning that no woman would ever be entirely worthy of her son, but she had maintained plausible deniability, never crossing a line so obvious I could point to it. I had managed her the way you manage a draft in an old house. You learn where it comes from, you learn to avoid it, you put on a sweater and carry on. She had not been happy about the move. I had registered that. When Daniel told her we were buying the house, she had gone very still for a moment. That particular stillness she had, like a pond just before something rises to the surface, and then smiled and said, "How wonderful." The words were fine. The stillness was not. I had filed it away and moved on because I was always filing things away and moving on. That habit, I was beginning to understand, had cost me dearly. In the weeks before we moved, Daniel had been distracted. He said it was work. He managed a small logistics company, and there were always fires to put out, always someone calling at inconvenient hours. He stayed late at the office twice a week. He answered his phone in the garden when I was inside. Once, I came downstairs at 2 a.m. for water and found him at the kitchen table with his laptop closed and his hands flat on the surface, just sitting in the dark. I asked if he was all right. He said yes. He came to bed and held me close, and I told myself, he is tired. We are both tired. This is what moving does to people. The day Eleanor arrived, 11 days after we moved in, on a Saturday morning when I had planned to finally organize the spare bedroom, I had been on my knees with a screwdriver trying to assemble a bookshelf. The house was still full of half-open boxes. The garden was overgrown. I was wearing paint-stained jeans and one of Daniel's old shirts, and my hair was in a knot that had not survived the morning. I was, in short, at my least armored. When the doorbell rang and I opened it to find Eleanor standing on my new front step with a bottle of Pinot Noir and that careful smile, my first thought was a brief, exhausted flicker of dread. Not alarm, just the familiar internal brace of someone who has learned to tighten up when this particular woman enters a room. Daniel was out. He had gone to buy shelving brackets and said he would be back in an hour. Eleanor knew this. I understand now that she had chosen the timing deliberately, that the absence of her son was not an oversight, but a precondition. She had wanted me alone. She accepted my offer of tea, walked slowly through the downstairs of the house as though making an inventory, touched the door frame of the kitchen with one fingertip, looked at my cream-painted walls with an expression I could not read, and then sat down at the kitchen table with a precision that reminded me of someone who has rehearsed the moment. I made the tea. I set out the cups. I waited for small talk about the neighborhood or the weather or how lovely the garden could be once someone got to it. And instead, Eleanor folded her hands around her cup, looked at me directly with those pale eyes, and said the words that broke open the next 3 weeks of my life. I need to tell you something about Daniel. And about your mother's things. The teaspoon was in my hand. I set it down on the saucer with a sound that was too loud in the quiet kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a bird made a single sharp call and stopped. "What about them?" I said, and I was proud of how steady my voice was, because nothing inside me was steady at all. Eleanor looked at her tea for a moment, just a moment, and then back at me. 6 months ago, she said, Daniel came to me. He was upset. He had found, or said he had found, that you were planning to sell those pieces, your mother's jewelry. He said you had spoken to a dealer and you were going to sell them without telling him. He said you'd told him they were worth nothing, but the dealer had given you a very different figure. She paused. He was angry. He felt deceived. Another pause, smaller. I believed him. I should not have believed him, but I did. I felt the kitchen go very still around me, the way a room goes still in the moment before a glass falls, that suspended instant when you see the trajectory and cannot yet reach out to stop it. Eleanor, I said quietly, I never spoke to any dealer. I haven't even opened that box since before we started packing. She nodded, as if this were exactly what she had expected me to say, as if she had been waiting for precisely those words. I know, she said, because 3 weeks ago I found the receipt. I set my cup down. My hands did not shake, not yet. The shaking would come later, alone, in the upstairs bathroom with the door locked and the tap running so no one could hear me. Right now, I was still in that suspended place, that strange, glassy calm that comes just before your understanding of the world restructures itself completely. What receipt? I said. Eleanor reached into the inside pocket of her coat. She had not taken it off, I noticed now, as though she had known she might need to leave quickly. And she placed a folded piece of paper on the table between us. She did not push it toward me. She simply laid it there, like evidence at a hearing, and folded her hands back around her cup and waited. I unfolded it. It was a printout, the kind you get from an email with the header stripped, a receipt from an antique and estate jewelry dealer on the other side of the city, dated 4 months ago, 3 months before we had even exchanged contracts on this house. The receipt was for an appraisal. The name on the appraisal was not mine. It was Daniel's. And the items listed, a gold brooch, 2 rings in yellow gold with colored stones, a pendant on a fine chain, a pair of drop earrings, were described with a precision that made my throat close, because they were my mother's, and I had never in my life described them to Daniel in that level of detail, and yet there they were, described with jeweler's accuracy, as though someone had held them under a loupe. The appraisal value at the bottom of the page was $42,000. I had believed they were sentimental objects, with perhaps a few $100s of resale value. I had never checked. My mother had never mentioned a number. She had pressed them into my hands and said, "These go with you," and I had taken them and held them, and never thought to ask what they might be worth to anyone who did not love her. $42,000. The number sat in the center of my vision like a black spot. I blinked. It remained. I looked up at Eleanor. She was watching me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not warmth exactly, because Eleanor did not do warmth easily, but something adjacent to it, something that looked, improbably, like regret. When Daniel came to me 4 months ago, she said quietly, he did not tell me about any appraisal. He told me you were the one who had gone to the dealer. He told me you were planning to sell those pieces and put the money into the house without telling him, and that you had lied to him about their value. She paused. He said he needed help understanding what to do, whether he had any legal claim, as your husband. Another pause, shorter. I told him I thought he did. I helped him research it. I thought I was helping him protect himself from you. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere in the walls, a pipe ticked. I stared at the receipt. I could not make myself look up yet. Daniel. Daniel had gone to a dealer. Daniel had stood in a stranger's office and handed over my mother's jewelry and watched a man in a white coat examine them under a loupe and write down a number. Daniel had done this without telling me, without asking me, without a single word. And then he had gone to his mother and told her I was the one who had done it. "Where are they now?" I said. My voice came out very level. Even I was surprised. Eleanor looked at her cup. "I don't know," she said. That's what frightens me. I pushed back my chair. I stood up. The receipt was still in my hand, and I was aware of its weight, which was nothing. It was paper. It weighed almost nothing. And yet it felt like something load-bearing, like if I let go of it, the floor might give way entirely. I walked out of the kitchen, through the hallway, up the stairs that still smelled faintly of the previous owner's carpet cleaner, to our bedroom, to the wardrobe, to the bottom drawer. I pulled it open. The silk scarf was there, the pale gray one, folded exactly as I had left it. I picked it up. Beneath it was nothing. The velvet box was gone. I stood holding the scarf for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. The drawer was empty. The space where the box had been was just drawer. Wood grain paper lining, small and ordinary and completely bare. I put my hand flat into the space, as though the box might be invisible, as though touching the absence might change it into presence. It did not. My mother's things were gone. The brooch she had worn on her wedding day, the rings her mother had brought from another country, carried across borders and through decades and into my mother's careful keeping, and finally into my hands, my specific hands, because she had said, "These go with you, not with anyone else, with you." Gone. My hand trembled in the empty drawer, and then the trembling spread up my arm and into my chest, and I sat down on the bedroom floor because my legs simply stopped holding me. And I sat there on the pale wood of my new house and shook. When I came back downstairs, my face was dry. I had sat on the floor for 4 minutes. I had watched the clock on the nightstand, counting, because counting was something concrete to hold on to. And then I had stood up, closed the drawer, gone to the bathroom, run cold water over my wrists, looked at myself in the mirror, and made a decision. The decision was this. I was not going to fall apart. Not here, not yet. There would be time to fall apart later, in private, completely, down to the foundations. But right now I had a receipt in my hand and a woman at my kitchen table who, for reasons I did not yet fully understand, had driven 3 hours to hand it to me. And I was going to find out everything she knew before Daniel came home with his shelving brackets and his quiet eyes and his 6 years of apparent kindness. Eleanor was still at the table. She had not moved. She looked up when I came in, and something in my face must have told her the box was gone, because she closed her eyes briefly, just briefly, and then opened them again. "Tell me everything," I said. I sat down. I put the receipt on the table. I waited. She told me. It took nearly an hour. She spoke carefully, in her precise and measured way, choosing words the way she chose everything, with consideration, with an eye toward consequence. What she told me was this: that Daniel had not simply gone to a dealer for an appraisal, that after the appraisal, he had gone to a second dealer, a private buyer, someone Eleanor knew through a neighbor, a man who handled estate pieces discreetly and quickly and without the documentation that a proper sale would require. That her neighbor had mentioned Daniel's visit in passing, not knowing it was a secret, not knowing Eleanor would find it significant, and that Eleanor had asked questions and the neighbor had answered them, and the picture that emerged had kept Eleanor awake for 3 weeks before she did anything at all. That she had waited because he was her son and she had not wanted to believe it. That she had eventually searched his home office while he was at work and she was supposedly helping with the move, and found, in a locked drawer whose key she had found in a kitchen junk drawer because Daniel had never been as careful as he thought he was, a second receipt, a sale receipt, $40,000 in cash, dated 2 months ago. I looked at the surface of my kitchen table, my cream-colored walls, the window above the sink that showed the overgrown garden, gray and still in the morning light. 2 months ago, Daniel had sold my mother's jewelry for $40,000 in cash. $40,000 that had presumably gone somewhere I could not see. While I had been planning a future in this house, arranging boxes, painting walls in the color of good bread, "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. I was not accusatory. I genuinely wanted to understand. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because he told me you were lying, and I helped him, and you weren't lying." She picked up her cup, set it down without drinking. "And because," she said, more slowly, "I found something else in that drawer, something that frightened me more than the receipt." She reached back into her coat pocket and produced a second folded paper. This one was not a printout. It was handwritten, on a page torn from a notebook, in handwriting I recognized immediately and completely. Daniel's handwriting. Neat, compact, slightly slanted to the right, the handwriting of the grocery lists and birthday cards, and the note he had left on my pillow the first morning after we moved in that said, "We're finally home." Same hand, same compact, neat letters. The note read, in full, "Floor, under the radiator in the hall, the box from her father. Check if same maker." I read it 3 times. Then I looked at Eleanor. "What box from my father?" I said. Because my father had died when I was 9, and he had left me nothing I knew of, nothing anyone had ever mentioned, nothing that had ever appeared in any drawer or cupboard or conversation in my entire adult life. Eleanor looked at me for a long moment. "Your mother left more than the jewelry," she said. "Her solicitor contacted you 2 years ago. You were in the middle of a house move, the old apartment. Daniel received the letter. He told me he had told you about it." She stopped. "He told me you had decided to deal with it later, that you'd said it wasn't urgent." She stopped again. "He read me the letter, Anna, the solicitor's letter. There was a second item, a small box from your father held in storage. Your mother had kept it separately because she wasn't certain what it contained. She only knew it had belonged to him, and she believed it should go to you. The solicitor was asking for an address to deliver it to." The house was absolutely silent. I was not breathing correctly. I could feel my pulse in my temples and in my fingertips and somewhere behind my eyes. Daniel had received a letter from my mother's solicitor. Daniel had read that letter. Daniel had not told me. For 2 years in the same apartment, in the same bed, at the same table, Daniel had known about a second inheritance I did not know existed, and he had said nothing. And he had intercepted whatever delivery followed, and he had hidden something under the floor of this house. I stood up. I was moving before I had consciously decided to move. I went into the hallway. The radiator was there, old cast iron, original to the house, one of the things we had decided to keep for its look. I crouched beside it. The floorboard directly beneath it looked no different from any other floorboard. I pressed the edge of it with my fingers, and it shifted. Just slightly, barely a millimeter, but it shifted. I looked up at Eleanor, who had followed me and was standing in the kitchen doorway. She nodded, once. I went to the kitchen, found a butter knife. It was the first flat thing I touched, and came back and worked the edge of the board up with hands that were steady with a kind of coldness that frightened me slightly, because I recognized it as the temperature of absolute fury. The board came up. Beneath it, wrapped in a cloth that smelled of must and old wood, was a small rectangular box. Not velvet. Wood dark and worn smooth, with a clasp that had gone green with age. I lifted it out. It was heavier than I expected. I opened it. Inside, on a bed of deteriorated silk that had once been ivory, were 3 gold coins. Large, heavy, old in the way that means genuinely old, stamped with faces and dates I could not immediately read. And beneath them, folded into a square, a handwritten letter in my father's handwriting, which I knew from the 3 notes my mother had kept in her own jewelry box, the notes he had written her before they were married, the notes I had memorized at age 9 because they were all I had of him. The letter was addressed to me. It began, "My Anna, if you are reading this, then I was not there long enough, and I am sorry." I did not read the rest, not then. I folded it back up and held it in both hands and looked at the wall, and Eleanor stood in the doorway, and neither of us said anything for a very long time. Daniel came home 40 minutes later. I heard his key in the lock, heard the door open, heard him call my name from the hallway in his ordinary voice. Cheerful, slightly distracted, the voice of a man returning with shelving brackets, the voice of someone who believed everything was proceeding according to plan. I was sitting at the kitchen table. The receipt was on the table in front of me. Eleanor was sitting across from it. The wooden box was beside my hand. When Daniel walked into the kitchen and saw his mother's face and then mine, he stopped. The carrier bag with the brackets was still in his hand. He looked at the table. His face did not collapse. He was not a man who showed things quickly. But something behind his eyes went very, very still. "Anna," he said. Just my name. A whole attempt at an explanation compressed into 2 syllables. "Don't," I said, quietly. The cold fury was still there, steady as a current beneath ice. "Sit down, Daniel." He sat down. He looked at his mother, and something passed between them that I watched and catalogued. A flicker of panic, a fractional widening of his eyes, a question he could not ask aloud. Eleanor looked back at him with an expression that was neither apologetic nor triumphant, but simply final. He had been her son for 38 years, and she was, in this moment, not on his side. I watched him understand this. What followed was not a screaming match. I want to be clear about that, because when I tell this story, people always expect the screaming. There was no screaming. The conversation that happened at my kitchen table that morning was the quietest conversation of my life, and it was worse than any shouting I have ever witnessed, because everything was controlled and deliberate, and there was nowhere to hide inside it. Daniel confirmed what he had done in pieces, the way a structure fails. Not all at once, but in increments, each admission releasing the next, the whole thing coming apart in careful, terrible sequence. Yes, he had taken the jewelry for appraisal. Yes, he had sold it. Yes, he had received the solicitor's letter. Yes, he had intercepted the box. Yes, he had hidden it. When I asked him why, he said something I had not expected. He said he had been planning to tell me. He said he had needed to understand the full picture first. He said he had wanted to make sure it was what he thought it was before he involved me. His voice was very calm. His hands were flat on the table. He believed, I realized, that he could still manage this, that if he stayed calm and presented each piece carefully, he could construct a version of events that I would accept. "You sold my mother's jewelry," I said. "The pieces she pressed into my hands in a hospital bed 2 weeks before she died, and said these go with you, not with anyone else. You sold them." I watched his face. "For cash, to a private buyer, without telling me." I paused. "And you've been sleeping next to me for 2 months. He opened his mouth. I raised one hand and he closed it again. "I'm not finished," I said. "You intercepted a legal letter addressed to me. You withheld a communication from my mother's solicitor for 2 years. You hid a box that my father left me under the floor of this house." I paused again. "What were you going to do with the coins, Daniel? Were you going to have those appraised too?" The silence stretched out like something physical, like a cable pulled to its limit. Daniel looked at the table. Eleanor looked at her hands. I looked at the wall behind them both and thought about my mother's face in the hospital bed, papery and tired and still entirely her, pressing the velvet box into my palm with those seamstress's hands. And something inside me completed its final, decisive shift. "I would like you to leave the house," I said. I stood up. "Both of you. I would like to make some phone calls." Daniel looked up. "Anna, please, let's just talk about—" "I have a solicitor," I said. "My own solicitor. I made an appointment with her 3 weeks ago when I found your search history on the shared computer. I didn't know what I was preparing for at that point. Now I do." I picked up the wooden box. I picked up the receipt. I looked at my husband of 6 years and I said, "I know what the jewelry cost. I know what the box contains. And I know you've been using a second phone, Daniel, because I found it in the pocket of your winter coat when I was organizing the wardrobe last week. I didn't look at what was on it. I put it back. But I told my solicitor it existed." I paused. She says that's going to matter. He stared at me. He had gone slightly gray. Eleanor stood up from the table, and she looked at her son, and she said nothing. She had said everything she came to say. She picked up her coat, which she had never taken off, and she walked out of the kitchen without touching the wine she had brought, and a moment later, I heard the front door close. Daniel and I were alone in the kitchen for the last time. He looked at me across the table, across the receipt, across the distance of $40,000 and 2 years of withheld truth, and I saw him searching for something, an angle, an appeal, a door that was still open. There was none. I had closed every door in the 4 minutes I sat on the bedroom floor counting seconds, and in the hour I spent listening to his mother, and in the weeks of quiet watchfulness before that, in all the small moments I had filed away and moved on from, and finally stopped moving on from. "Get out," I said. Still quiet, still level. "Take what you need for a week. My solicitor will be in contact with yours by Monday." He left. I heard him on the stairs, in the bedroom, the sounds of drawers and wardrobe doors, and then his footsteps coming back down, and the front door again, and then nothing. The house was completely quiet. I stood in my cream-colored kitchen with my father's box in my hands and listened to the refrigerator hum and a bird call from the overgrown garden and the distant sound of a car, and I breathed. The coins, as the solicitor informed me 6 weeks later, were 19th century gold sovereigns, 8 of them, in excellent condition. Their value at auction was considerably more than the jewelry. My father had kept them for 20 years in a bank deposit box, and my mother had transferred them to the solicitor's storage without ever opening the wooden case herself, trusting that whatever her husband had left was for me to discover in my own time. The solicitor's letter that Daniel had intercepted had included a notarized inventory. His interception of it constituted, according to my solicitor, a clear case of suppression of probate correspondence. The second phone contained evidence of a plan that was more deliberate than even Eleanor had understood. Messages between Daniel and a man I did not know, discussing the coins as though they were already his, dated to before we had even moved in, before he had been under that floor, before, I understood, this entire move had been partly about access to what he believed was hidden there. The $40,000 from the jewelry was recovered in full through the divorce proceedings. It took 8 months, and it was not simple, but it was done. The private buyer, when contacted by my solicitor, proved cooperative in a way that suggested he had his own reasons to avoid legal scrutiny. The coins I kept. I did not sell them. I had them cleaned and photographed and properly cataloged, and I put them back in the wooden box, and I put the box on the shelf in my study where I can see it from my desk. Eleanor and I have spoken twice since that morning. Brief, careful conversations, conducted with the awkward formality of 2 people who have crossed a boundary together and are not sure what that makes them. I do not know what to make of her. She did what she did when she did it, for reasons that were partly conscience and partly something else I am still sorting out. She was not a hero of this story, but she was not its villain either, and in a story that required me to revise almost everything I thought I knew about the people around me, that particular complexity is something I am still making room for. I live alone in the house now. I have planted tomatoes in the garden. Not as many as I planned, because first I had to clear the beds, which were worse than I expected, which turned out to be something of a theme. The kitchen is still cream-colored. The bathroom door still swings wrong and hits the towel rack. On the mornings when the light comes in right, warm and low and golden across the floorboards, I sometimes stand in the hallway for a moment before I start my day, and I think about what is solid and what is not, about what endures and what only appears to, about the difference between a house that is yours and a life that is yours, about how it is possible to build both from the same ruins. My father's letter is in my bedside drawer. I've read it many times now. It is a short letter. He says what he wanted for me, what he hoped. He says, "Build something real, my Anna." I intend to.